I've always done everything I could to protect my son, Jason. Ever since he was diagnosed with severe asthma and a rare immune disorder, my life revolved around making sure he was safe, healthy, and never without his medication. Every morning before school, I triple-checked his backpack, inhaler, emergency EpiPen, antihistamines, and his daily prescribed medication, before kissing him on the forehead and sending him off. It was a routine I'd perfected, a ritual of reassurance. But nothing in my worst nightmares could have prepared me for what happened that fateful afternoon. Started with a call from the school nurse, or rather, a lack of one. Normally, if Jason had even the slightest wheeze or discomfort, I'd get an immediate call. But on this particular day, silence. The first sign something was wrong came when I picked him up from school. I saw him walking toward me, his little shoulders hunched, his face pale, his breathing labored. My heart dropped into my stomach. The moment he got into the car, I knew something was off. His lips had a bluish tint, his chest rising and falling in that frighteningly familiar struggle for breath. "Where's your inhaler, buddy?" I asked, trying to keep my voice calm. He shook his head, his hands trembling. "Ms. Reynolds took it," he whispered, barely able to get the words out. My blood turned to ice. "What do you mean she took it?" I asked, gripping the steering wheel so hard my knuckles went white. "She said I don't need it, that I'm just faking to get out of class. She took all my medicine and threw it away," Jason wheezed, tears welling in his eyes. "Dad." I told her I couldn't breathe, but she said I was being dramatic. I swear, if rage had a taste, it would have been bitter in my mouth. My mind raced. Jason had gone the entire day without his medication? His condition wasn't a joke. He had nearly died before from a severe asthma attack that spiraled into anaphylaxis. I could barely contain the anger boiling inside me as I reached into the glove compartment, grabbing his backup inhaler and handing it to him. "Take deep breaths," I coached, watching as he struggled to inhale the medicine that could have prevented all of this. That woman put my son's life at risk. I turned the car around so fast the tires screeched against the pavement. I wasn't going home. I was heading straight to that school. I stormed into the office, Jason barely keeping up behind me. The receptionist started to greet me, but I cut her off. "Where is Ms. Reynolds?" I demanded, my voice dangerously low. I wanted answers, and I wanted them now. "She's in her classroom, sir." But I was already walking. My boots echoed against the linoleum floors as I made my way down the hallway, my pulse hammering in my ears. My son could have had a fatal attack, and this woman had the audacity to dismiss his condition as fake? When I reached her classroom, I didn't knock. I threw the door open so hard that it slammed against the wall, causing every kid in the room to jump. There she stood, Miss Karen Reynolds, with her stiff, judgmental expression and arms crossed like she was the victim here. "Oh, Mr. Carter," she said in a tone dripping with condescension. "There's no need for dramatics." "Dramatics?" My voice came out like a growl, barely contained. "You took away my son's medication," she scoffed, shaking her head like she couldn't believe I was making a big deal out of it. Jason was being disruptive. Every time he starts his little breathing problem, he causes unnecessary panic. He needs to learn that he can't just use it as an excuse to get out of class. I stepped forward, my hands clenching at my sides. This woman, this reckless, ignorant woman, could have killed my son, and she was acting like he was some manipulative troublemaker? "He has a diagnosed medical condition," I spat, my voice shaking with anger. "He could have died today, and you threw away his lifeline. Do you have any idea what you've done?" She rolled her eyes, muttering something under her breath. Then she had the nerve to say, "Parents like you coddle their kids too much. It's why they grow up weak." That was it. I turned to Jason. His breathing was steadier now, but his eyes were still glassy with exhaustion. I knew he needed rest, but I also knew I wasn't leaving this school until I got justice. I took a deep breath, clenching my fists to keep myself from saying something that would get me arrested. "Principal's office." "Now," I said, my voice sharp as steel. Ms. Reynolds huffed, crossing her arms, but I wasn't asking. I grabbed Jason's backpack and let him out, my heart hammering with fury. This wasn't over. Not by a long shot. I had never been a violent man. Never once had I raised my fists in anger, never lost control of my temper, no matter how much life had thrown at me. But as I marched down that school hallway with Jason at my side and Ms. Reynolds trailing behind me with that infuriatingly smug expression, I felt a rage so pure, so blinding, that my hands physically ached to curl into fists. I kept my voice level, but my jaw was so tight it hurt. "We're going to see the principal. Now." Ms. Reynolds had the audacity to laugh behind me. "Oh, Mr. Carter, don't be so dramatic. If you're expecting sympathy from Principal Gardner, I'd advise against it. He trusts my judgment, not the complaints of helicopter parents." She was arrogant, too arrogant, as if she had gotten away with this kind of thing before. I turned slightly, just enough to meet her gaze. "We'll see about that." When we entered the office, the receptionist opened her mouth to ask if we had an appointment, but Principal Gardner, an older, stern-looking man with graying hair and deep frown lines, looked up from his desk and sighed like he already knew what this was about. That sigh told me everything. He glanced at Ms. Reynolds. "What's the issue now? Now? So this wasn't new. This wasn't some mistake or a one-time lapse in judgment. Ms. Reynolds had a history of this. My fingers twitched at my sides, and I had to take a deep breath before speaking. "The issue, Principal Gardner, is that this teacher threw away my son's medication, refused to let him use his inhaler, and nearly sent him into an asthma attack." My voice was ice, sharp and slicing. "I want to know what you plan to do about it." The room was silent for a long moment. Then Gardner pinched the bridge of his nose, letting out another tired sigh before saying, "I'm sure it's not as serious as you're making it sound." Jason made a small noise beside me, a wheezy, exhausted breath that sent a fresh wave of fury coursing through me. "Not as serious? Not as serious?" I leaned forward, planting both hands on his desk, my body vibrating with the sheer effort it took to contain my rage. "Are you telling me," I said, my voice slow and deliberate, "that my son's life isn't serious to you?" Principal Gardner frowned. "Mr. Carter, please lower your voice." "I will not," I snapped. "This woman endangered my child. She took away life-saving medication. If Jason had collapsed in her classroom, would she have even called for help? Or would she have just let him suffer, thinking he was being dramatic?" Ms. Reynolds made a scoffing noise. "He wasn't in any real danger." My hands curled into fists. She still didn't get it. Before I could speak, Jason tugged on my sleeve. His small, tired voice cut through the tension. "Dad, I don't feel good." I looked down and my stomach dropped. His face was pale, his breathing shallow. I had been so focused on this argument, so consumed by my anger, that I hadn't even realized he was getting worse. "No, not here." I didn't hesitate. I scooped him up into my arms, his little body too light, too limp, and turned on my heel. I was done wasting time on people who didn't care. I didn't even glance at Ms. Reynolds as I said, "If anything happens to my son, I swear, you will regret it." Then I was out the door, running down the hallway, my son's shallow, wheezing breaths in my ear. I didn't bother with the car. I called an ambulance right there in the parking lot. The dispatcher's voice was calm, professional. "Sir, can you describe the symptoms?" "Yes," I said, trying to keep my voice steady as I knelt on the pavement, keeping Jason propped against me. "He has asthma, he hasn't had his medication all day, and..." I stopped. Something was wrong. Jason's eyes fluttered. His breathing was worse now, quicker, more shallow, his chest barely rising. "Sir," the dispatcher prompted. My pulse pounded. He's struggling. It's not just asthma. It's something else. Do you have an EpiPen?" I did. I always did. But as I reached for it, Jason's tiny fingers clutched my wrist. His lips moved, but the words barely came out. "Hurts?" A different kind of panic gripped me now. Jason's symptoms weren't just asthma. His throat was swelling. Anaphylaxis. The realization hit me like a truck. His body was shutting down. This was worse than I thought. I fumbled for the EpiPen, uncapped it, and pressed it into his thigh with shaking hands. 1, 2, 3. Jason jerked, gasping, his little fingers digging into my jacket. "You're okay, buddy," I whispered, my voice breaking. "You're okay." But was he? Because as I held him close, I realized something terrifying. Jason hadn't eaten anything that could trigger his allergies. Nothing out of the ordinary. So why was he having an anaphylactic reaction? The ambulance arrived, paramedics rushing over. I barely heard them as they checked his vitals, barely registered when they lifted him onto a stretcher. I followed them into the ambulance, my mind racing. Something was wrong. Something wasn't adding up. And as I sat there, Jason's small, fragile hand in mine, I thought back to that morning. His breakfast was safe. His lunch. I had packed his lunch myself, like always. Peanut-free sandwich. Safe snacks. Water. But what if he hadn't eaten what I packed? What if? My stomach dropped. I turned to Jason, his weak, wheezy breaths barely above a whisper. "Buddy," I said softly, "what did you eat today?" His fingers twitched against mine. "Ms. Reynolds gave me cookies," he mumbled, eyes half-lidded. "She said I didn't need special food." The world tilted. She gave him food that wasn't safe. She knew about his allergies. She knew, and she did it anyway. I closed my eyes, rage and terror swirling together in a way I had never felt before. Ms. Reynolds hadn't just taken his medication. She poisoned him. The sirens screamed through the streets as the ambulance tore across town. I sat beside Jason, my heart pounding with every shallow, wheezy breath he took. His tiny hand was still wrapped in mine, but his grip was weak, barely there. Every few seconds, his eyelids fluttered like he was on the edge of slipping away. I kept talking to him. I had to keep him awake. "Hey, buddy," I whispered, my voice hoarse. "Remember that trip we were planning? The one to the beach?" His lips moved, but no sound came out. "You're gonna love it," I went on, my grip tightening around his fingers. "We're gonna build the biggest sandcastle, and I'll teach you how to skip rocks. You always wanted to learn. Remember?" A tear slipped down my cheek as he gave the faintest nod. The paramedics worked frantically beside us. One was monitoring his vitals, another preparing in four, their voices clipped and urgent. "He's stabilizing," one of them said, relief washing over his face. "The EpiPen helped, but his airways are still constricted. We need to get him on a stronger steroid as soon as we reach the hospital." Stabilizing, but not safe. I closed my eyes for a moment, swallowing the burning rage still clawing at my throat. Ms. Reynolds had done this. She hadn't just been careless. She had knowingly endangered my son's life, and I was going to make sure she paid for it. When we reached the hospital, the doctors took Jason from my arms and rushed him into the emergency ward. I stood there, frozen, helpless, as nurses moved around me, shouting orders, adjusting monitors, running for lines. A hand landed on my shoulder. One of the paramedics. "He's in good hands now." I nodded stiffly, but inside I was far from okay. My son should have never been in this situation. I pulled out my phone. I wasn't waiting for the school to handle this. I was making a call. By the time Jason was settled in a hospital bed, breathing through an oxygen mask, a storm was already brewing. My first call had been to my lawyer. My second to a local news station. By the time I made it back to the school, there were 3 reporters standing outside, microphones ready. And I was more than ready to talk. The principal's office was tense when I stormed inside. Principal Gardner was there, looking frazzled, like he was already regretting every decision that had led him to this moment. Ms. Reynolds sat across from him, arms crossed, still wearing that smug, self-righteous expression. I didn't sit down. I didn't even greet them. I threw a copy of Jason's hospital admittance report onto the desk. "This is what you did," I said, my voice deadly calm. Gardner picked it up, his face going paler with every line he read. "Mr. Carter, I understand that you're upset." "Upset?" I let out a sharp, bitter laugh. "My son almost died today. Because of her." I turned to Ms. Reynolds, my hands shaking with the effort it took not to grab the nearest object and throw it. "You took his medication. You ignored his symptoms. And then, when he was already at risk, you gave him food you knew he was allergic to. Her smug mask cracked. Gardner's head snapped toward her. Is this true? She scoffed, rolling her eyes. Oh, please. It was just a peanut butter cookie. Kids these days are so sensitive. That was it. I slammed my fists on the desk so hard that both of them jumped. He has a life-threatening allergy. She flinched, but I wasn't done. Do you even understand what you did? What could have happened? My son was seconds away from losing his life because of you. Gardner looked horrified now. Ms. Reynolds, you never mentioned. I thought he was lying. She snapped, exasperated. Like my son's suffering was an inconvenience to her. Gardner shook his head slowly, running a hand down his face. This is serious. Oh, you think? I barked. I already called my lawyer. The school board will hear about this. The police will hear about this. Her face lost all color. I didn't mean. You meant it, I said coldly. You just didn't think you'd get caught. At that moment, the office door burst open, and in walked two police officers. Ms. Reynolds visibly shrank. Wait! What? One of the officers stepped forward. Ms. Reynolds, we need to speak with you regarding child endangerment and negligence resulting in bodily harm. She stammered, glancing wildly at Gardner. You're not seriously. He didn't look at her. He wouldn't even meet her eyes. He was already distancing himself from her. Smart man. Ms. Reynolds, the officer continued, pulling out handcuffs. Please stand and put your hands behind your back. For the first time since this nightmare began, I felt something close to satisfaction. She was done. Outside the school, the reporters were waiting. They already knew. Cameras flashed. Microphones thrust forward. Voices overlapping. Mr. Carter, is it true your son was hospitalized due to negligence? How do you feel about Ms. Reynolds being arrested? What do you want to happen next? I looked directly into the nearest camera. I want justice, not just for my son, but for any other child who's ever been mistreated like this, and I meant every word. This wasn't over. Not until every single school knew. No teacher, no administrator, no one was going to get away with endangering a child ever again. Jason made a full recovery. Ms. Reynolds? She lost everything. Fired, charged, publicly disgraced. And as for me, I made sure every school in the district implemented stricter policies for handling medical conditions. Because no other parent should ever have to experience what I did that day. And no other child should ever have to suffer because of someone like her.